Biden's policy shift, allowing the ATACMS missiles to strike inside Russia, is pushing the world to the brink of nuclear war. At least that's what every article seems to be saying online. But is this actually just Russian propaganda? I'm Paul, U.S. Army combat veteran. Let's get to the bottom of the so-called nuclear escalation threat. Okay. So you've probably seen a bunch of articles online like this one from right-wing outlet The Daily Mail. Europe prepares for World War III. It says, now Germany reveals plans to mobilize national defense and 800,000 NATO troops after Kremlin nuclear threat as U.S. announces new weapon that Kiev can use to stop Russia after allowing long-range missile strikes. So in addition to the fact that this headline appears to be written by a poorly trained AI, this is sort of what you would expect from a standard propaganda outlet. Now, what I want to point out is that the first part of this references Germany's national defense plan. And this is something that Germany and every country has. There is a plan to defend the continental United States. There is a plan to defend England from invasion. There is a plan to defend France for invasion. And those plans are updated generally annually. Some countries do it every 2 years. And in the event of an attack on Germany, yes, all NATO troops would mobilize. That is how Article 5 works. So you ask yourself then, why does this need to be included? Why does a routine update to a national defense plan get included, right? And juxtaposed against this. Again, the policy that they're referencing is the United States allowing Ukraine to use ATACMS missiles to strike targets inside of Russia, but not all of Russia, only within Kursk and surrounding oblasts, right? This, of course, the White House has said this is a response to the Russian escalation of bringing North Korea into the war as a belligerent. Now, the fact that these and other articles are rolling out is a sign that the Russian propaganda machine, I think, is actually working overtime. And we're gonna break down just why. But here's a somewhat more measured article. It says Russia says Ukraine attacked it using long-range missiles, signals it's ready for nuclear response. Right. So this is a more recent article, but again, it's really juxtaposing two things that this is part and parcel to the Russian strategy. Now, the CNBC is not knowingly parroting Russian propaganda, but what it is doing is repeating something that Russia has said. And the fact is that if you look at what Russia actually says, it doesn't say that much. Now, they acknowledge something that, no secret, Ukraine launched an ATACMS strike against a Russian military target. Both Russia's defense ministry, the Ukrainians, and the Americans confirmed that this attack happened. But here's what's most interesting, is that let's see if we can find the actual statement by the Russia's foreign minister, Sergei Lavrov. He said, quote, the fact that ATACMS were used repeatedly tonight in Bryansk is, of course, a signal that they in the West want escalation. And without the Americans, it is impossible to use these high-tech missiles, Lavrov said. And again, that's not really a nuclear threat. That's not even saying this is an escalation. It just says the West wants escalation. And the thing is, with escalation, it's sort of a weird kind of convoluted way of phrasing things, right? Now, Vladimir Putin on Tuesday, so again, worth noting that this was updated a decree for an updated nuclear doctrine, shifting the parameters on when Russia can use nuclear weapons. What's fascinating about this is that for this document to be signed on Tuesday, it had to be prepared long before the Ukrainians received authorization to use ATACMS. So how could the Kremlin have known before it happened that the ATACMS policy shift was going to happen? So in all likelihood, these are just two random events. And Putin has been updating his nuclear doctrine. But again, we're going to talk about the fact that this is sort of ridiculous. And again, it says, quote, this is from the Kremlin's press secretary. He says, quote, you will be able to read the paragraphs yourself, but in general, it also states that the Russian Federation reserves the right to use nuclear weapons in the event of aggression with the use of conventional weapons against it or the Republic of Belarus, which creates a critical threat to sovereignty or territorial integrity. This is right. And it also adds aggression against the Russian Federation by any non-nuclear state with participation or support of a nuclear state is considered a joint attack. So this is not actually a change to policy. And we're going to break down why this is Russian propaganda here in a second. But first, if you feel like you need a little bit of extra oomph to what you're doing, you don't need to engage in nuclear saber rattling. Instead, you might need a little extra caffeine. That's why you want to check out Strike Gum. We're the highest rated energy gum on Amazon, right? If you're tired of spending $5 a pop on energy drinks at a gas station, you can get the same caffeine, zero sugar in the form of Strike Gum. So go to strikegum.com or go to Amazon and search for Strike Gum. The link is in the description. Okay, so let's break down and peel back some layers here of why I think this is Russian propaganda. The first layer is that this is not actually a change to Russian nuclear policy because it says something that's always been true, right? That if there is a critical threat to sovereignty or territorial integrity, right? And that has been Russia's consistent policy the entire time. And one of the other things that's worth noting is that the ability to threaten the sovereignty of a country, right, or its fundamental territorial integrity is something that is much heavier than anything Ukrainians doing. Is Ukraine threatening the sovereignty of Russia? Like, is the Ukrainian military threatening the Kremlin or Putin or his ability to lead the country? No, it's pretty clear that the war is largely contained to Ukraine, except for literally 20 kilometers or 25 kilometers of border region in Kursk, right? And of course, territorial integrity is a little bit more of a squishy term, but again, he says critical threat. So again, is losing a few kilometers of Kursk a critical threat to territorial integrity? No. And the Ukrainians did this without the U.S. authorization or awareness. Now, this is important because, again, this is not, none of these, the Ukraine war does not meet these conditions, right? In fact, the use of ATACMS does not meet these conditions. So Russia itself is saying, we're not going to respond to ATACMS because they aren't threatening, right? There is no, it would take a large, there is no way an ATACMS missile could threaten the sovereignty of Russia. It's just not possible, right? There aren't enough ATACMS in the world to flatten Moscow, which is what it would take to be considered a meaningful threat to Russian sovereignty. And again, no amount of ATACMS strikes will replace annexing Russian territory. And the fascinating part about this is that Putin himself recognizes that according to these conditions, Ukraine is the one with justification to use nuclear strikes, right? If Ukraine had the same policy, they would have been justified to nuke Moscow, right? Because unlike the war as Russia experiences it, Russia is attempting to threaten the sovereignty of the Ukrainian government, and they are absolutely threatening the territorial integrity, permanent occupation and annexation of Ukrainian sovereign territory by Russia. And of course, this is obviously true. There does not need to be a nuclear threat. Just like would we be justified, the United States, of using nuclear weapons if, for example, Chinese paratroopers were to occupy New York and DC, right? Yeah, of course. Of course. Now, here's the other thing to remember, is that this is a standard playbook by Vladimir Putin, right? And this is literally has its own Wikipedia article called Russian Nuclear Blackmail. As you can see, 3 days after the launch of the invasion, Putin ordered Russian nuclear forces to go into high alert, right? In April of 22, he tested a long-range missile and said that countries should think twice before threatening Russia. Right? Later that month, Lavrov said support to Ukraine could cause tensions, which could potentially lead to a World War III scenario involving Russia's full arsenal of weapons. When you see things like could or might and lead to, this is not a threat, right? Like that, it is possible, for example, that it's like the domino meme, right? It's possible that a lizard in Zaporizhzhia that gets exposed to radiation could become Godzilla. It could happen. Is it likely? Is it plausible? Is it possible? Probably not, right? But almost anything could lead to almost anything else, right? This is sort of how causal chains work, right? It's like the butterfly effect. Technically, a butterfly flapping its wings could cause a tornado in Kansas. But we can't sit there. We don't go around exterminating butterflies because it's possible, right? So again, this is in April of 22. You could see that even during the major Ukrainian counteroffensive operations, where Russian units were in danger of being destroyed, this was in late 2022 in Kherson and Kharkiv, Russia actually did consider a possible nuclear strike, but opted against it, likely because Russia's few allies said, listen, this is not an option. In September, Putin threatened nuclear war. In October, there was another town, Kadyrov threatened nuclear war. You can see every year has at least half a dozen instances of Russian using nuclear blackmail in kind of this oblique way. And again, what I want to point out too is that the Kremlin has, in a few instances, actually gotten intelligence that Ukraine is going to do something that is actually beyond the pale, right? And in that event, what Russia did was their foreign minister picked up the phone and called the United States directly and said, listen, we got intelligence that Ukraine is going to do event X, and event X is actually beyond the pale. And it is actually something that we will be forced to escalate. And we're calling you, the United States, their primary ally and supporter, to make sure that you tell them that this cannot happen. And that happened twice throughout the war, right? So that should tell you something. The fact that Russia has a tool that they've used to de-escalate actual situations. So then you got to ask yourself, if they have a special de-escalate button, why would they choose instead to make these large, vague public pronouncements where they are a recipe for misunderstanding, right? Because let's be clear, nuclear war is bad and no one wants it, right? And so Russia, why would they have an incentive to create confusion? And the answer is that's how nuclear blackmail works. See, by threatening people with your nuclear arsenal, you can achieve a lot of international objectives. It's sort of like saying, right, imagine you walked into Target carrying an AR-15. You have no intention of shooting anyone. In fact, it's fully legal for you to do so in a lot of states. But you also start to pick some clothes off the shelves. And when you do that, you walk out of Target. Now, do you have to shoot someone to get away with it? No. Who's going to stop you, right? Presumably, in a society, the police stop you. But by you using a massive threat to engage in relatively routine levels of escalation or criminal behavior, right? You can effectively deter people from trying to stop you. Now, again, in a civilized country, the police will be called, right? And they will intervene and stop you from repeatedly using your gun to steal from people. But in the international system, there is no world police. And so if you have an AR-15, you can steal from any store you want, so to speak. And that is sort of the thing that, even if you don't have any intention of shooting somebody, in fact, even if you couldn't shoot somebody, as long as people believe your AR-15 is loaded, you can steal from anybody, almost anybody, right? You just have to, the only time is when you'll realize you screwed up is when someone else shows up with an AR-15 and says, you can't take that. And then you have to decide, right? Is this worth a shootout in my local grocery store over, right? So that's why I point these things out, because that is how nuclear blackmail and nuclear coercion works. But here's the other thing. Here's the other thing about the escalation bros, is that only the US gets blamed for engaging in escalation, right? So how do we know something is an escalation versus a response? Right? What is escalation? It's expanding and growing the conflict in unprecedented ways that no one has before. So who has been guilty of that recently? Rack your brain. Who has recently introduced elements to the conflict that are unprecedented? Why, you might think to yourself, is it Is it the White House for allowing a existing weapon system to be used at a slightly longer radius when Russia has kind of already militarized that area of their territory? No. In fact, the person who did it first was actually Vladimir Putin. Why? Because he brought in a whole other country into a belligerent, right? People go, oh, we're in danger of World War III. And you know what? I sort of agree. But we are in danger of World War III because all the countries, all the dictators of the world look at the West and they say, the West doesn't do shit. They go, guys, the buffet is free. They've realized that there's no one that's going to stop you from stealing from the target, okay? You show up with an AR-15, there are no cops, they've said. The West, they talk a lot of big game, but the West will never show up. So that's why Kim Jong-un goes, yeah, you can take my soldiers and you can take them and we'll join the conflict. Our soldiers will fight side by side, shoulder to shoulder, right? Because even though us North Koreans are much smaller and have an outdated military, the West is simply standing by and watching these things happen. And so these countries are emboldened because the West isn't really committed to defending its allies. They're going to say, listen, and what's going to happen? What do you think North Korea is going to get out of this once Russia wins, right? And Russia, trust me, Russia has shown they are always willing to escalate the conflict until they get their desired outcome. So, because they believe that the West isn't really going to match them, right? Again, North Korean troops currently fighting in Russia. A whole third country has entered the conflict. And the US's response is to slightly increase the range at which one particular weapon system is allowed to be used. That's it. That's your response in, by the way, one specific oblast. This is not escalatory. It is folding. It is a signal to Putin, and Putin was receiving this message, that the U.S. is not really that committed, that the U.S. is ready to back away from this conflict and is looking for an out. The other reason you can be pretty confident that Putin isn't going to use nukes is because he didn't use nukes when he was losing the war, right? When his forces were being battered out of Kharkiv, when they're being pushed out of Kherson, right? When the Russians couldn't advance anywhere in the front line, when no one was making progress. Putin still didn't pull out the nuclear card, right? And so why would he do it now when he's literally advancing? This is working backwards through time, but you can literally see Russian forces advancing near Kharkova. You can watch them as we work backwards through time. You can see the advances that they've made. Why would Putin change the game fundamentally when he believes he is currently winning? And why should he? Again, his message is that the U.S. is weak, the West is uncommitted to their allies, and I can guarantee you that when Russia gets whatever it considers a victory out of Ukraine, those Russian tactics and that Russian support, and maybe even that Russian military, they're going to go to Korea, they're going to go to China, and those guys are going to use the same tactics that beat the West to achieve their other objectives. Like, again, unifying the Korean Peninsula and annexing Taiwan. Because again, there's just a perception now that support from the West is weak, that the West isn't committed to supporting its allies, that the West isn't interested in escalating, that they've gone as far up their own response ladder as they can. Again, not an escalation, it's a response. Putin is the one who chose escalation. Anyway, guys, that's all I had. Huge thank you to James Sterling, Steve Moran, Doug Beck, Alan Knutson, Bastian Himmerling, Brian Kelly, Dale McCombs, James Ola, Henry Roussier, and others. All our Lieutenant Tier members, hit that subscribe button. That does make a difference, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Cheers.